The moment I realized I was in trouble was somewhere in the middle of a slow dance, at a wedding I had no business being at, with a woman who had introduced me to everyone in the room as her husband. She was looking up at me. The song was quiet. Her ex-boyfriend was watching from across the room with an expression I recognized, the particular look of a man who has just understood he made a mistake he cannot take back. And I was supposed to be thinking about that. That was the whole point of tonight. Instead, I was thinking about the way her hand felt in mine, about how she had leaned in, just slightly, like the space between us had gotten smaller without either of us deciding to close it, about how none of this was real, and how that fact was becoming harder to hold on to by the minute. My name is Caleb. I'm 27, and I work as an electrician in Brooklyn, which means most of my days are spent pulling wire through walls, fixing breaker panels, and sweating through my shirt in attics that were never designed with human comfort in mind. It's honest work. I'm good at it. I go home tired in a way that doesn't leave much room for anything else, which, for a long time, suited me fine. I had been going to Blue Kettle for about 8 months before any of this happened. It's a small restaurant a few blocks from one of my regular job sites. Good coffee, strong soup, a corner booth in the back where nobody bothers you. That's the story I told myself about why I kept going back. The actual reason was Mara. She worked the section with my booth. She remembered I took my coffee black before I had to ask more than once. She remembered I ordered soup on cold days. She knew I put my phone on the left side of the table and my water glass on the right, which is the kind of detail that matters less than it sounds like and more than I could explain. I knew it was just good service. I knew she did this for everyone. But after a long day of work, those small recognitions had a way of making the world feel less anonymous. And I kept showing up for them the way you keep going back to a place that makes you feel, without quite meaning to, like you belong somewhere. I never said anything. I thought about it. 100 times I thought about it. But she was at work, and I didn't want to be the guy who made her feel like her smile was currency, like she owed me something for the price of a tip. So I kept my distance and told myself that was the right thing to do, which it probably was, and which I resented completely. The night everything changed, she came to my table and I knew right away something was wrong. Her smile was there, but it wasn't right a half second too late, held a fraction too long, the way smiles look when someone has been keeping them assembled for too many hours. Her eyes were slightly red. Her hand on the order pad was not entirely steady. I asked if she'd had a rough day. She opened her mouth to say she was fine. I could see the words forming. Then she looked at me, actually looked at me, not at the customer she was serving, but at me specifically, and whatever she'd been holding up seemed to shift. She glanced toward the counter, checked that her manager wasn't watching, and sat down across from me. She told me about Brett. 3 years together, she thought they were going to get married. He left her for someone else, someone who matched the life he decided he wanted, which, apparently, Mara did not. And now, this weekend, she had to go to a friend's wedding where Brett and his new girlfriend would both be there, and she didn't want to walk in alone. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her like that. She talked with her hands twisted together on the table. She wasn't asking me to fix anything. She was just telling the truth to someone who wasn't going to carry it back to anyone she knew, which is its own kind of courage. Then she looked up. She said I didn't have to say yes. She said seriously twice. Then she asked me if I would go to the wedding with her. I started to answer. Then she added, very quietly, as her husband. I stopped. I want to be honest about what happened in the next few seconds, which is that I did a very fast internal calculation that I am not entirely proud of. On one side, this was a strange request from a woman I barely knew, outside of coffee orders and soup. On the other side, it was also the first time in 8 months that I had a reason to spend actual time with her that wasn't me sitting in a booth while she worked. I said, before I answer, I need to know one thing. She looked at me. I asked if the fake husband got to dance with his wife. She stared at me for a second. Then she laughed, a real one, surprised out of her, the kind that changes a person's whole face. Her eyes were still wet, and she was laughing anyway, and something about that undid me a little. She said, probably. I said, then I'm in. In the days before the wedding, we met a few times to get our story straight. We had been married 6 months, kept it quiet. Met when I came to fix the electrical panel at Blue Kettle, which was actually true. I had done that job. I just didn't mention that I had noticed her that day and thought about it for 3 weeks afterward. She made notes. She wrote down my birthday, my coffee order, the neighborhood I grew up in. She was thorough about it in a way that told me she was nervous, that this mattered more to her than she was letting on. At one point, I mentioned that our cover story was pretty close to the truth. She looked up from her notebook. "What do you mean?" I told her I'd actually come to fix the breaker behind the kitchen, that I'd noticed her that day, that she'd been arguing with the espresso machine and losing. She blinked. "I don't even remember that." "I remember it," I said. She studied me. "So you've been remembering me since then?" I looked away. I said I had a good memory. She didn't say anything else. But she didn't write anything in the notebook either, and when I looked back, she was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. On the day of the wedding, I drove to her apartment in a suit I'd borrowed from a friend that fit well enough not to be embarrassing. When she opened the door, I forgot for a moment what I was supposed to say. She was wearing a deep blue dress. Simple, no performance to it. She looked like herself, only more so, which is the only way I know how to describe it. She looked like the version of herself she was when nobody was asking anything of her. She looked at me and said, "I look different from the guy who sat in the corner drinking black coffee." I held out my hand and said apparently fake husbands have a dress code. She put her hand on my arm. The touch was light, and it went through me like a current. I already knew the night was going to be harder than I'd planned. Brett showed up with his girlfriend early in the evening. The moment Mara saw them, her whole body changed. Shoulders up, fingers tight on my arm. Breath held in that particular way of someone bracing for something. I leaned down and spoke near her ear. "Look at me." Not at them. She did. I put my hand on her back, steady, not dramatic. I said, "You don't have to prove anything tonight. You're not alone." It was a small thing to say, but I meant every word of it, which was the problem, because I was supposed to be performing, and I was not performing. Brett came over not long after. He looked at Mara, then at me, then at Mara again, doing the math. When she introduced me as her husband, the surprise on his face was exactly what she'd needed to see. He asked when this had happened. I said we'd kept it private because Mara didn't like turning personal things into a show for other people. It shut him down cleanly. He moved on. I stayed in character the whole evening. I pulled her chair out. I got her drinks. I remembered she hated onions and told the server before she had to. When people asked how we'd met, I told the story we'd rehearsed, but I kept adding details I hadn't planned on how she made every room feel calmer, how she put other people first automatically, how she could make you feel, from across a restaurant, like you were the only person in it worth noticing. She turned and looked at me while I was talking. Something shifted in her expression. I was losing track of the line between the story and the truth. When the slow song started, I turned to her and asked if my wife felt like dancing. She smiled and said only if my husband didn't step on her feet. I put my hand on her waist. She put hers on my shoulder. We moved slowly across the floor while Brett watched from the side of the room with an expression that had nothing of victory left in it. She said softly, "I almost forgot he was here." "Good," I said. "Tonight isn't about him." She asked what it was about then. I wanted to tell her the truth. Instead, I said it was about her having a good night. She didn't answer. She leaned in a little closer. Her cheek almost brushed mine. I could feel the warmth of her through the fabric of her dress, and my heart was going at a rate that had nothing to do with the tempo of the song. By the end of the evening, Brett looked openly miserable, which was what Mara had wanted. I found I didn't care about that anymore. I only cared that her hand was still in mine, and that when we walked out into the cold night air, this version of us would be over. I drove her home in a quiet that felt different from the quiet on the way there. When I parked in front of her building, she didn't move right away. She sat with her hands in her lap, looking down. She said, "So our marriage is over already." I said short, but not terrible. She smiled, but kept her eyes on me. Then she asked if I wanted to come up for tea. I should have said no. I said yes. We sat on her living room floor in our wedding clothes, eating leftovers straight from the containers. No performance left, nothing to maintain. She told me about the cafe she wanted to open someday. A small place, warm light, old wooden tables, the smell of coffee in the air. A corner where people could sit for an hour without being rushed out. I listened without saying much. But in my head, I was already thinking about the wiring, about pendant lights over the counter, about what it would take to make every corner of that room feel exactly the way she described. I kept that to myself. At some point, she said she liked the way I talked about my work. I told her it was just a job. She said it wasn't. She said I talked like I understood that turning on a light in a room was a way of pulling someone out of the dark. I didn't know what to do with that, so I stayed quiet and let it sit between us. Later, she told me about Brett. Not the wedding version, the real version. How she'd believed in him for 3 years. How when he left, the worst part wasn't losing him, but losing the belief that she had been worth staying for. That maybe if she had been more of something more successful, more polished, more whatever he'd gone looking for, he would have stayed. I felt anger move through me. I kept my voice steady. I said him leaving didn't prove she was missing something. It only proved he didn't understand what he had. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she asked what I saw. I could have deflected. I had been deflecting for 8 months. Instead, I told her the truth that I had noticed her the day I came to fix that panel. That I had paid attention every time I came in after that. That the way she treated people, the small, consistent kindnesses she showed without calculation or audience, was rarer than she probably knew. That I had stayed in that corner booth twice a week for months because she made an ordinary Tuesday feel like it was worth showing up for. Her eyes went glassy. The space between us was smaller than it had any right to be. I looked at her and gave her every chance to pull back. She didn't. She said my name, barely above a breath. I kissed her. Slow at first, careful, the way you are was something you've been afraid of breaking. Then her hands came up and gripped the front of my shirt, and the carefulness went out of it entirely. After that night, we stopped pretending there was a reason to keep our distance. She came by job sites, sometimes with coffee from a cart down the block. I waited outside Blue Kettle on nights she closed, and we walked and talked about nothing and everything. And neither of us called it what it was, but it was already what it was. Then the call came from Chicago. A contractor I had worked with years ago had a long-term project, big commercial building, lead electrician, real money, a path to something I had spent years working toward, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come back if you pass on it. I was going to turn it down. I hadn't told Mara yet. She found out anyway. When I got to her place that evening, she already knew, and the shift in her was immediate. Her voice went to a place I hadn't heard before, careful and flat, like she was reading from a script she had prepared. She said we had gone too far from what this was supposed to be. She said she wasn't sure her feelings were real or just leftover grief from Brett. She said I should take the job, that I shouldn't throw away a real future for her. I said her name. I told her I could see what she was doing. She turned her face away and said she wasn't scared. She was being honest. I asked her what the kiss had been, what all the nights were, what she thought this had been. She said, quietly, that maybe she had just needed someone after Brett, that I had been the right person at the right time. That was all. I stood there and looked at her and could not find the woman who had leaned into me on the dance floor. She was using the same voice and the same face, but she was somewhere behind it, and I didn't know how to reach her. I asked if she really believed that. She didn't answer. The silence was enough. I left. I kept waiting on the way down the hall for the door to open, for her to call after me. I made it to the street before I understood she wasn't going to. A few days later, I accepted the job. I packed what I needed and drove west with a weight in my chest that the miles did nothing to reduce. I had been in Chicago for almost 2 months when Claire called. Claire was Mara's closest friend. She'd known from the beginning the whole thing was a setup. I almost didn't pick up. I figured whatever she had to say was going to be a version of what Mara had already said, just delivered by someone else. She started talking before I could decide. She told me Mara hadn't pushed me away because she didn't love me. She had pushed me away because she did. Because she thought staying for her would cost me something I'd spent years working toward. Because she believed she wasn't worth that price. She told me Mara had cried after I left, that she was still crying, that Brett had found out the whole thing was fake and had been coming around ever since, gentle and persistent, and Mara was confused and exhausted and believed I was gone for good. Claire said, "She loves you, you idiot. She just didn't think she was allowed to keep you." I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against the cold metal of the truck. Everything I had told myself over 2 months that she had been clear, that I had been a fool, that I'd read something into nothing, started coming apart. I told my foreman I needed a few days. I drove back to New York without stopping, except for gas. When I got to Blue Kettle, it was evening. Through the window, I could see her at the counter. Brett was in front of her with flowers, talking fast, leaning in like a man who believes persistence is the same as deserving something. She looked smaller than I remembered. I walked in, the bell above the door rang. She turned. When she saw me, her face did something I had no name for yet. I crossed the room. I didn't look at Brett. I told her I needed to talk to her. She was gripping the counter. Her eyes were already filling. Brett started to say something. I turned to him and kept my voice low and even and told him to go. He looked at Mara. She didn't look back at him. He left the flowers on the counter and walked out. The restaurant went quiet. I stood in front of her and said what I should have said 2 months ago, the night she tried to make me believe I had imagined everything. I told her the first night had been fake. I told her it stopped being fake for me a long time before the wedding was over. I told her I had driven back from Chicago, not because I had nothing to go back to, but because she was the thing I was going back for. And I was done letting her decide my future without me. She was crying. Not quietly the real kind, the kind you can't manage. She said she was sorry. She said she had been scared. She said she had thought letting me go was the only way to love me right. I closed the distance between us. I said she didn't get to decide my future for me, not even to protect me. She said she knew. She said she was wrong. I said I was wrong too. I should have fought harder instead of believing the worst. She looked up at me. She said she loved me. She said I was never a replacement. She said the only reason she had said those things was because they were the only words she had that were strong enough to make me leave. I pulled her in and held her and didn't let go for a long time. We figured out the rest. Chicago was a few more weeks at a time, New York in between. It wasn't seamless. It wasn't easy. But we were honest with each other about it, which made it something we could actually carry. A year later, I ran the electrical on a small renovation job on a corner space in Brooklyn. Pendant lights over the counter, warm bulbs in the reading corner, every outlet exactly where she wanted it. She picked the paint color and I told her it was going to look different under the lights. And she told me she trusted me, which was the best thing anyone had ever said to me in a professional context. The Corner Light Cafe opened on a Thursday in October. It was fuller than either of us expected. People sat with books and laptops and stayed longer than they planned, which meant the lighting was right and the room felt like what she had always said she wanted. It to feel like a place where you could sit for an hour and feel like the city outside was not your problem for a little while. That night after the last customer left, I put on the slow song from the wedding. She turned around from behind the counter and saw me standing there with my hand out. She laughed. She said, "What are you doing?" I said, asking my wife to dance. She walked over and put her hand in mine. She asked, "Still fake?" I pulled her close. I said, "It never really was." We danced between the empty tables under the lights I had hung with my own hands, in the place we had built together, and outside the city kept going the way it always did. And inside, everything was exactly still and exactly right. I used to think the best part of my week was a corner booth and a cup of coffee and 2 minutes of conversation that meant more to me than the woman having it knew. Turns out, the best part of my week was always her. I just needed one strange evening, one slow dance, and a lie that kept turning into the truth to finally say so.